Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua's love.
Alrighty, we are back. All prophecy fulfilled. We are in a series titled Gentiles, Christianity's Best Kept Secret. And what your pastor never told you about atonement. That's what we're going to talk about today, or at least we're going to get around to talking about that today. So speaking of that, hey, would you consider yourself a Gentile? Some of you probably would. How about this? Would you say that the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, according to the Bible, was an atoning sacrifice, not only for the sins of Israel, but the sins of the whole world, Jew and Gentile, which would include you? I'm guessing you would say yes, of course. In fact, you'd say, you know what, Ryan? The Bible says that explicitly somewhere in 1 John something or other. And I say, yeah, you're right. Why don't we take a look at that? Look, if you've got the fortitude, if you've got the curiosity, if you want to take an honest, more thorough look at this, well, stay with me. Stay with me on the series. Stay with me on this lesson, because we're answering that question and I'm giving reasonable scriptural responses to that very question. So, last lesson, we contrasted the bad news with the good news, right? Israel's scattering, but on the other side of that redemptive coin, you have her gathering. And since it's a redemptive story, Israel's good news, as told by the prophets, it always seemed to be right on the tail end of the bad news, right? It was always nearby. It was always right there in the context, and sometimes just immediately afterwards, right? And I referenced a few passages that demonstrated that. Hosea chapter 2 was one of those. So I'm going to read that to you again. I want you to pay attention to the pronouns, the yous, the thems, the hers, the she's, the thems, and all that. So here we go. Hosea chapter 2, we had the bad news. Okay, it says in Hosea chapter 2, starting around verse 13, I will not have mercy on her children, speaking of Israel's future generations, for they are the children of harlotry. I will also cause her mirth to cease, her feast days, her new moons, her Sabbaths, all her appointed feast. I will destroy her vines and her fig trees. I will punish her for the days of Baals, which she burned incense. So, no doubt, this happened. This was their story. The house of Israel was indeed punished. But, as I always say, you got the good news, right? Immediately after that, I will allure her into the wilderness, and I will speak comfort to her. And it shall be in that day, says the Lord, that you Israel, you house of Israel, you will call me my husband. In that day, I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, with the birds of the air and the creeping things of the ground. Bow and sword of battle I will shatter from the earth and make them lie down safely. I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, loving kindness and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. Okay. And this is where so many people will say, okay, right there, Ryan, right there. These animals are clearly Gentile animals, and they're coming into covenant with Yahweh. The prophets use animal imagery like beasts to depict peoples or nations other than Israel. So these right here, these are pagans. That's what these are. And this proves that the new covenant would basically open up for all humanity. And I say, well, yes, these animals are indeed Gentiles. These are of the Goyim. But specifically, what Goyim are they? And that really is the question, and that's a deeper question, and that's a good question, because only a specific goy, only a specific group of people from the nations, from the Gentiles, would be offered into Israel's new covenant. Which ones, you ask? Well, the very ones who had been scattered into the goyim, and those were Israelites. So, look, we've got to stop generalizing or genericizing, I guess, the term Gentile. Let me help you contextualize it a little bit. So, in Hosea chapter 2, God is clearly speaking to Israel, okay? And I said to take note of those pronouns. When he says you, he's addressing Israel. And yet, he seems to turn his attention to them. Okay, them being the future generations of Israel, children of harlotry. That's the them. That's the initial them. And then Israel is also referred to as her. But in verse 14, the covenant seems to be for another or a different them. The beast, the birds, the creeping things, right? And we know that covenant is tantamount to marriage, like a marriage covenant. And yet, God says, I will betroth you, Israel. So, here's what I'm going to do. Sorry, I got a little rabbit trail that I have to chase here. I'm going to switch gears, and I'm going to put Hosea chapter 2 kind of on the back burner, but I want you to keep this in your noggin here. And I'm going to chase a rabbit down a trail here because this reminded me right here. This reminded me of something. For me, Hosea chapter 2 brought to mind Deuteronomy chapter 32. When God Yahweh, through Moses, is talking to Israel about Israel. Kind of similar to Hosea here. Okay? He's addressing his audience, Israel, while referring to Israel prophetically in the future. Okay? In fact, he's not only is he addressing Israel in the future, here's the kicker, in my opinion, he's actually ever so cryptically or subtly referring to two distinct groups within Israel's future. I'll show you. I will show you here. And I think we get a glimpse of this, and I'm going to show you here. He seems to turn, this is Deuteronomy 32, he seems to kind of like turn, and he looks into Israel's future, their future story, and he describes the future generations of Israel, generations that would become not my people, he says. And to me, that sounds like Hosea describing Ephraim, who'd become, the house of Israel. But he also condemns them, a perverse generation that would come to their end, right? At the end. And that sounds like the remaining kingdom, the house of Judah. So here's Yahweh, Deuteronomy 32, through Moses, and he's basically given a rundown of what's in store for his people's future. I mean, this is like a 30,000-foot view of the entire redemptive story, Deuteronomy 32. That's what it is. It's pretty cool. You get the whole ball of wax right there if you're paying attention. So keep that in mind. Okay, so just listen to some of these verses that I pull out here. I can't read the entire chapter. That'll take too long. But just listen, and now that you, by now, this is lesson number 4, you kind of have this big picture perspective of the scattering and the gathering. Try to listen to this through that lens, through that filter, okay? So Deuteronomy chapter 32, here's some miscellaneous passages. I'm actually starting in 31, the very last verse, then we'll get into 32. Here we go. Then Moses spoke in the hearing of all the assembly of Israel the words of the song until they were ended. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. And hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. Jumping up to verse 5. They have corrupted themselves. They are not his children. Or not my people. Same thing. We've heard that before, haven't we? because their blemish, a perverse and crooked generation. Little fun fact for you, you will not find that phrase, that description of Israel, a perverse and crooked generation, until we get all the way into the New Testament and Jesus and Paul are describing their very generation as exactly that, perverse and crooked. Do you thus deal with the Lord, O foolish and unwise people? So more on the foolish and unwise phrase or terminology in a second, because we're going to come up with that. We're going to come to that again. Is he not your father who bought you? He found him in a desert land and in the wasteland, a howling wilderness. He encircled him. He instructed him with the law. He kept him as the apple of his eye. We all know Israel is the apple of God's eye, right? But here's the but Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat. You grew thick. You are obese. Then he, Israel, forsook God who made him and scornfully esteemed the rock of his salvation. They provoked him to jealousy with foreign gods. Now, obviously, by now, we see this is Israel's story. We've talked about it ad nauseum, right? This is Israel's story under the curse of the law, forsaking Yahweh and his law through idolatry. With abominations, they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons, not to God. To gods they did not know. To new gods, new arrivals that your fathers did not fear. Of the rock who begat you, you are unmindful and have forgotten the God who fathered you. And when the Lord saw it, he spurned them because the provocation of his sons and daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. And we saw this a time or two, haven't we? We've talked about this. God would hide himself from Israel. He even divorced the house of Israel. He said of Ephraim or to Ephraim, he is joined to idols. Leave him alone. God hid his face on Israel. I will see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faith. And again, I think we see exactly how both Paul and Jesus address that very generation, perverse and crooked, right? They have provoked me to jealousy by that which is not a God. They have enraged me with their worthless idols. Now listen up. I will make them jealous by those who are not a people. Now again, this is huge, okay? We know by now there's only one people, Israel, Ephraim, who was promised to and who was made not my people, right? So think about this. That perverse generation, they are going to be provoked to jealousy by these people who are not my people, which is Ephraim. That's Israel. Israel would be made jealous by Israel? Yeah. Israel, who became not my people, but it would later be called sons of the living God. And I know that most people say this is referring to Joe Blow Gentiles with no connection to Israel. But when we get to the New Testament, and we will see how Paul, he's going to cite this very verse right here in Romans 10 about Israel being made jealous. But he's going to do it in conjunction with numerous other citations. And you know what he's going to do? He's going to tether the full number of the Gentiles coming into the kingdom and the Gentiles making Israel jealous. And he's going to tether those fulfillments to Old Testament verses about scattered Israelites and their eventual gathering. But we're going to get there. Okay? So, in other words, he's going to call the Gentiles Israel and vice versa. So, okay, let's carry on. I will make them angry by a nation without understanding. Okay, we got to pay attention to the language here. without understanding, foolish, we mentioned that earlier, without knowledge, unwise, that terminology. These are always ways in which Yahweh and the prophets referred to unfaithful, law-breaking Israel, especially the Goyim, right? They were without understanding. They were the same as not my people. I think this is the house of Israel here. The Jews were indeed angered, and they were jealous, not by Joe Blow pagans, but by scattered Gentile Israelites coming into the kingdom by faith. And there's numerous verses in the Old Testament that describe Israel as just this, right? And to be fair, both the house of Judah and the house of Israel were described in this very way. 2 Kings 17:15. They rejected his statutes, his covenants, which he made with their fathers, blah, blah, blah. And they followed vanity. And they became vain. They became foolish, unwise, worthless. That's what he's saying. Right? And they went after the nations which surrounded them. Okay, and they did like them. Jeremiah 4. Again, I think this is more directed at the house of Judah, but he says, my people are foolish. They have not known me. They are silly children. They have no understanding. There you go. They're wise to do evil. They have no knowledge. It's knowledge. My people were destroyed for lack of knowledge. They're unwise. Amos 3, he's speaking of Israel, Ephraim, they don't know to do right. They're unwise, foolish. Isaiah 45, 20, assemble yourselves, come, draw together, you who have escaped the nations, the Goyim. They have no knowledge, right? Who carry the wood of their carved image and pray to a God that cannot save. Well, that sounds like the house of Israel. Right? That sounds like their story. They were told not to make carved images. Well, that's exactly what they did. Why? Well, they have no knowledge. They're unwise. They're foolish. Okay, carrying on. What were we at here? Verse 23. I will heap disasters on them, for they are a nation void of counsel, nor is there any understanding in them. There you go again. Oh, that they were wise, that they understood this, that they would consider their latter end. Now again, this sounds like the house of Judah's fate. The Jews, that is. They came to their end. We know that. And they're described this very same way. So again, there's really not much difference in the behavior and the descriptions really between house of Judah and house of Israel. The difference is the house of Judah was the one to carry that covenant to its end. So look, you have to really understand this. Deuteronomy in Moses, really. This right here, Deuteronomy, the entire thing. This is the foundation on which the prophets stood. It's like the teaching text where all the prophets developed their preaching material. I mean, that really is the case. I don't think that's an exaggeration. This right here, Deuteronomy 32, this is like where all the Old Testament prophetic last days things, they spring out of, they grow out of. And I wonder if you're seeing this, right? This is, like I said, this is like a 30,000 foot view of what all the prophets constantly described. They, the house of Israel, and the house of Judah, but they, the house of Israel, they were a foolish, idolatrous nation. They were unwise, no understanding. They were cut off, and they were moved from the covenant community into the other category, not my people. And they, the house of Judah, they really didn't fare much better, but like I said, they carried that covenant forward, right? But that final perverse generation, well, they would later come to their latter end. And look, I know it's kind of subtle, maybe it's a bit murky, but I really think Moses is actually painting it's almost like a cryptic prophetic picture of two future distinct groups within Israel. And if you think I'm reaching, maybe I am, but stay with me. Here's the grand finale. Okay, I'm getting to that. Remember at the beginning of this, we see Yahweh, right? Moses, and he's talking to all Israel, the whole assembly of Israel, about Israel, right? And at this time, there's no divided kingdom, right? This is the whole assembly. And he keeps teetering between you and them, you, them, you, them. And it's like he's saying, look, you, Israel, you're going to be them. And that's pretty much the bad news right there. He's given them the bad news. But what do I always say about the bad news? What always comes with the bad news? The good news. The good news is coming. Now check this out. This is the finale. Pay attention. Verse 36. For the Lord will judge his people and have compassion on his servants. Bump up to 43. Rejoice, O Gentiles, his people. And by the way, there's no with. It's not Gentiles with his people. You don't have two groups there. It's not Gentiles with his people. That's not in the text. I know it's probably in your translation, but it's not there in the Hebrew. So it's rejoice, O Gentiles, his people. For he will avenge the blood of his servants, there's Israel's prophets, and render vengeance to his adversaries. He will provide atonement for his land, his people. There's no and there. He will provide atonement for his land, his people. Wait a minute. Gentiles, his people. Now, first of all, we know that it's indisputable that first covenant Israel was God's people all the way throughout the scriptures. Israel belonged to Yahweh. And I know that we so desperately, man, we want to say that something happened with the new covenant. And it magically opened up, right? So that all humanity, everybody of faith would become Abraham's seed, right? And Gentiles like ourselves can be God's people. But look, I'm sorry, but that is assuming so much that the text just doesn't say. And it's neglecting so much more. Three points on this. 3 points. Let me drive this home for you. Point number one, verse 36. This is the very picture of the good news, bad news that I talked about last lesson. You basically have two fates here at the end of the chapter. You've got salvation and you've got judgment. That's what's in view. But listen to this. Only those experience the bad news, right? The death and the curses of the law. We've talked about this. Only those who experienced the bad news needed the good news. What was the good news? Well, no more law. The curse would be removed. Good news, bad news. So with the end of the law, that's the good news, came judgment by the law for those who rejected the good news. Vengeance, judgment, and wrath were only for those under the law. Who warned you from the wrath about to come? John the forerunner said to Jews. He was a prophet of Israel. The wrath belonged to those who were under the law. The law brought wrath, said Paul somewhere in Romans. Only one people had Yahweh's law. Only one. The judgments pertain to Israel alone, which is the only people he's talking about throughout this chapter in chapter 32. Perverse, corrupt Israelites who forsook their God and their covenant with him. What was the result? They were judged and they came to their end. Same for the scattered Gentile Israelites. They too were held guilty. They were guilty of idolatry, forsaking their covenant and law. That's what the whole story is about. That's why they were scattered. But here's the deal. All Israel, both houses, the elect of faith would be gathered and they would find compassion. That's verse 36. Compassion, salvation from the wrath of the final judgment, and salvation from the death and the curse of the law. Point number 2, in verse 43. Question: why would a non-Israelite Gentile, why would they rejoice for the avenging of Israel's prophets? I mean, what the heck did Israel's prophets have to do with them? Right? If they were totally detached from Israel, what did they care? What did it have to do with them? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's nonsensical to think they would rejoice over that. Does Matthew 23 ring a bell? I'm not going to go there right now. Number 3, again in verse 43, atonement. These Gentiles are basically rejoicing over 2 things. Number 1, Israel's prophets being avenged, and their atonement. Wait a minute. Who in the Bible is placed under law and subsequently required to atone for their sins ad nauseum throughout the story via their sacrificial system? Weekly, monthly, yearly, year after year after year after year, atonement. Israel! That's Israel. Their need for atonement was specific to and a direct corollary to their law. The Hebrew word is kafar, and it means to cover. It means to pacify. It means to make propitiation for. And when it comes to covering sins, my friends, you're not going to find this word used in all the Bible in relationship to any other sins other than the covering of Israel's sins under Israel's law. You just won't. So why or how can these Gentiles, here in chapter 32 at the very end, how can they be rejoicing over their atonement? Look, unless there's some other story of law and covenant besides Israel's in the Bible, this really doesn't make a lick of sense for Gentiles. Unless these Gentiles had need of atonement due to their transgression of law, and that's what it would require. Well, you know what? That's what Israel's story is. Yes, the house of Israel, the house of Judah, their ongoing transgression and their ongoing need for atonement. I mentioned Daniel 9 last time, although I didn't do it very eloquently. I stuttered, so I wrote it down again. Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are determined for your people, Daniel, Israel, and your holy city, Jerusalem, to do what? To finish the transgression, to make an end of sins. Which sins? Sins under law, Israel sins. And to make reconciliation for iniquity. That word reconciliation, kafar. Israel's sins needed to be covered. Israel's sins. Ladies and germs, these Gentiles in Deuteronomy 32, these Gentiles rejoicing, they're rejoicing because they've come full circle back into the fold of Israel. This just fits with the story, man. The scattered Israelite Gentiles would rejoice with the house of Judah, and all Israel was saved. They would rejoice because God's people, who'd become not his people, would once again become his people. It's Yahweh saying, rejoice because you are God's people again. Because that was the promise to Abraham's seed, to Israel. 1 John 2:2. He is the atoning sacrifice or propitiation for our sins. Whose sins? Who's John writing to? He's talking to Jews. Okay, so he's saying, look, he is the propitiation for our sins. But not only ours, but the sins of the whole world. John didn't have planet Earth in view. He had Israel's world of law, Israel's covenant world in view. The whole world was Israel's world of law, and that included the scattered Israelites coming back into the fold. Those are the sins of the whole world. So, I'm sorry, but verses like 1 John 2:2, they really only make contextual sense, if you will, when they're viewed through the lens and through the filter of Israel's covenant world, Israel's world of law. That's the world in view. Okay, you know what? This really was a total rabbit trail. I apologize, but I don't. But the them in Hosea chapter 2 really made me think of this. So, and that kind of got me going. So, next lesson, we are going to look at the covenant in Hosea chapter 2. Who was invited? And along with that, I'm going to look at Hosea chapter 4, Romans 1 and 2, and we're going to see how Israel exchanged their glory for shame. How they exchanged their identity as God's sheep, really, for other unclean animals to become Gentile. And we'll look at that in the next lesson. If you stuck with me, I appreciate it. I'm proud of you. And we will see you next lesson. Hey, thanks for joining me. I'm having fun. I hope you are too. And see you next round. Take care. Bye.
Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah.